the 25th Hour podcast. I'm Elise.
And I'm Bianca. We're two former federal prosecutors, mothers, lawyers, here to decode Project 2025 by bringing you the subject matter and agency experts who can speak to the proposal's real-life implications.
For those who haven't heard of Project 2025, it was developed by the Heritage Foundation, which was founded in the 1970s and played a leading role in the conservative movement of the 1980s. The Heritage Foundation largely shaped the Reagan agenda, and the foundation reportedly now seeks to set the agenda for the next Republican president.
The proposal is nearly 1,000 pages and will vastly change our federal government and impact our daily lives as Americans. If you haven't read it, don't worry, we got you. Today, we're breaking down the sections relevant to the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, with our guest, Ken Alce. Ken, so excited to have you. It has been a long time coming, or a journey, in your words. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. You guys are rock stars. I'm such a fan, and I'm happy to have this conversation. Very important conversation, if I do say so myself.
We appreciate that. Let me tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and the amazing things that you're doing. So Ken is an attorney with the Securities and Exchange Commission's Office of the General Counsel. He has nearly 15 years of experience in mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, bank regulation, and capital markets. His practice now focuses on policy consulting and corporate financial rulemaking with the SEC. Outside of work, Ken is a mentor, host of financial literacy workshops, and he's a fellow member of the National Bar Association 40 Under 40 class of 2024. Shout out to the NBA for keeping us committed to being social engineers and not parasites. So Ken, we are so excited to have you. Let's start by helping the folks understand what the SEC does, right? You know, as lawyers, particularly in regulatory spaces, we know a lot about the SEC. But help people understand how the SEC's operations and its rulemaking really impact the average citizen, whether directly or indirectly.
Happy to do that. First, let me start off by saying a disclaimer that the SEC requires me to say. The Securities and Exchange Commission disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement of any SEC employee or commissioner. This conversation expresses the speaker's views and does not necessarily reflect those of the commission, the commissioners, or other members of the staff. Everything I say today is going to be in my personal capacity as a citizen of the United States of America and not as an attorney with the SEC. The SEC, generally, to answer your question, Bianca, the SEC oversees securities exchanges, companies, and individuals in the space, in the securities and the financial market space, in an effort to promote fair dealing, the disclosure of important market information, and to prevent fraud. We have many arms, including rulemaking, as you noted, enforcement, adjudication, trading, and markets. It's a very large agency that was brought forth. It was born during the 1930s after the Great Depression, after the great stock market crash of 1929. Essentially, that was at a time when a lot of these companies were, I'll say straight up lying about who they were, the profitability, whether or not they were actually going concerns. And so what they were doing is they're selling securities to the American public, but they didn't have anything behind those securities. And that culminated in the official stock market crash in 1929. And then President Roosevelt decided to put forth this agency. What at first, the intention was just to create disclosure responsibilities for these companies so that we know what they are and what they're doing, shedding a light into these companies. But as the financial markets, as financial literacy, as all these financial instruments have become more and more complex, the agency has grown and grown to where it is today with about 5,000 employees and doing just a fantastic work, in my personal opinion. Ultimately, what we do is we protect investors. We stand between investors and corporations. We require corporations to tell us about what they're doing, disclose what they're doing. We require, anytime there are exchanges of stock, we make sure that the stocks are being, that the investors who are engaging in these are being protected, so on and so forth. And, you know, we essentially are the drivers of the financial system in America. You know, we are a very important agency in that respect. Well, and we'll talk about this at some point, right, where a lot of people who may be opposed to the agency are asking for a lesser of a role, which creates some issues moving forward, because if you have a lesser role for the agency, then potentially you create an environment where we can go back, to use a candidate's expression, to a time when companies can do what they want, take investors' money, and investors are left holding the bag. So
That's a great
We
explanation.
segue nicely into something I want to know. No, this is Ken in his personal capacity, so appreciate the disclaimer. So I want to know, with all of your deep subject matter understanding of this system, what your reaction was to the proposal within Project 2025.
That is such a loaded question. It was such an interesting read, I will say that. My first thought when I read Project 2025, especially in connection with the agency and the other financial regulators, is to be kind, it comes across a little as underthought. That is to say, it's hard to read Project 2025 and feel like whoever wrote that section or a lot of those sections really understand the gravity of the policy choices that they are pushing. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite things about, especially the SEC section, is the author's sources, the footnotes. A lot of the author's sources are, wait for it, the actual author. A lot of his other articles are what he cites to be the evidence or the authorities with respect to a lot of their points. What they're trying to do with respect to Project 2025 is they're looking to streamline a lot of regulations, and they're trying to reduce mission critical personnel. Now, over the history of America, this has been generally the push and pull of progressives and conservatives, right? Conservatives want to make sure that, the capital formation elements of the SEC's mission is what they really want to push forward. When you reduce regulations, it allows for what they say are innovations in the financial space. You reduce the restrictions around what they can and can't do. It allows certain people to try to find new ways to come up with ways to make money, which at the end of the day is really what the intention is. And, there's something to be said about that. But at the same time, there has to be an element of protecting investors. As we just said, at the origin of the SEC, it was a time when, a lot of people were making money. But again, a lot of people were left holding the bag, and it led to the Great Depression, which affected everybody. What Project 2025 does, it comes across essentially as a supercharging of the conservative agenda. Again, they're looking to streamline, they're looking to reduce, they're looking to make sure that as many of the people who want to play with these financial complex instruments are able to without having to respond or having to answer to the American public. So what's interesting about Project 2025 in particular, and I just want to go ahead and put that on the table, is the current candidate pushing Project 2025 has a history of failed promises, right? Whether you want to, during that candidate's first term, the candidate pushed building a wall. The wall hasn't been built. The candidate pushed repealing Obamacare. Thankfully, that hasn't happened. The candidate pushed that they would eliminate debt in America. They would eliminate the deficit, and exact opposite happened during that candidate's term. So a lot of people see Project 2025 and that particular candidate, and they see it essentially the election as the effective date of Project 2025, that it starts the countdown essentially until Project 2025 goes into action. Rather, I see it as more of an implementation date, right? So the same way you kind of look at how the Tea Party, if you go back to that time period, kind of was the precursor to MAGA movement. The same way that, as you said, these almost 1,000 pages weren't written just so that, hey, if we win the election or if that party wins the election in November, then all of a sudden it's implemented. And if they don't, it goes away. I don't know about that. I think that what happens is that this is priming the American public to start thinking about a lot of these issues. They start thinking about, hey, what happens if we go ahead and reduce the SEC's authority and power? What happens if we go ahead and we eliminate, I think, the Department of Education or DOJ, so on and so forth? And what's kind of scary is that if you start looking at what's going on in the Supreme Court, where we're looking at the Kersey and Loper cases that essentially reduced the effectiveness of these federal agencies and reduced Chevron deference, for example, eliminating Chevron deference, we're starting to see a little bit of a thread that goes across that if you keep your third eye open, you're seeing ultimately, I don't want to go too conspirational or whatever, but if you keep your third eye open, you start seeing that, yeah, they're just trying to reduce the power of these federal agencies to protect investors, to protect the markets, and that some people have free reign.
Yeah. Wow. So much to unpack.
It's interesting because you mentioned the candidate, he's actually disavowed um, Project 2025 and claims he has nothing to do with it. However, its authors were all former members of his administration. So they're the architects of all of this. And so I just find it very hard to believe, despite his constant denials, that this would not be, to your point, implemented on January 21st. So I did just want to give that quick note, but I do think that this is the blueprint for the next Republican administration, should it come to be. So,
Yeah, you read my
Well,
mind. That was one of the things I did want to note. But I also wanted to call out what you said, Ken, because I think it's important. Those articles aren't peer reviewed, right? We're not in like the rules of evidence where you got to make sure that you're using experts who actually have been reviewed by their peers and validated. That's not the world we're in with these citations. So it's a whole different space. You alluded to the fact that the SEC came about because of the market crash right back in the 1920s. We know that there are a lot of regulations that came out of the financial crisis of 2008. We saw a financial crisis during 2020 during COVID, right? Some of the proposals are intended to scale back, like you said, the protections on the market, the protections on investors. Can you think of like a real life example for like a average Joe who invests in Nvidia, right? Like what's the impact of these proposals on the American citizen who is in the stock market not as an institutional investor, but as a person who is trying to build generational wealth?
I think you hit the nail on his head right there, right? So what happens is that that person will not have insight into what these companies are doing. For example, NVIDIA could say, oh, hey, we're starting to invest in AI. We're starting to invest in so on and so forth. They could say that. That sounds good. You as a personal investor, you hear that and say, oh my goodness, I need to invest in NVIDIA. I need to put all my money in this stock. And if you reduce the effectiveness of the agency, if you reduce the effectiveness of the Securities Exchange Commission, well, then all of a sudden that company that says they're doing X, Y, and Z doesn't have to actually do X, Y, and Z, because then they don't have to disclose what they're doing in connection to X, Y, and Z. They don't disclose. You just buy the stock off what they say. Next thing you know, the stock plummets when people actually find out that they are not doing X, Y, and Z. It's a scary, slippery slope when you take away these regulations, because now you're putting people in a position where they have to trust. And one thing about money and trust, it's a little bit of a tenuous relationship.
so Ken, let me just ask you this: well, if any effect would this proposal have on the SEC's authority over ESG and corporate responsibility?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, let's have a quick talk about what ESG stands for. I'm sure your listeners know, but ESG is an acronym for environmental, social, and governance. So what it is these are initiatives that the SEC, along with other agencies, are putting forth to require disclosure in this space. Let me give you one quick example. Earlier this year, the SEC put forth rulemaking with respect to climate change. What we were requiring is that companies disclose climate-related risks that are reasonably likely to have a material impact on that company's business. What that's intended to do is, again, the whole thing with the SEC, and I'll say this many times during this conversation, is about disclosure. Disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. We say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. While disclosing, we can also compel action. So with respect to climate change in general, we're seeing that there's a lot of pushback in that space. I'll also talk about a couple things with respect to the S&G section, right? The social governance part. We saw that a couple years ago, the SEC approved the NASDAQ's the board diversity rule. And that has been held up in a lot of litigation in the Fifth Circuit. When you have a lot of people who oppose it, what that creates is that with the board diversity rule, it requires, or at least NASDAQ is requiring its listed companies to disclose whether or not they have a woman, a board of director, or whether they have a person of color or minority, so to speak. And if they don't, to explain why. And some people are saying that implicates First Amendment issues about whether or not these companies have to speak, so on and so forth. So it's kind of being held up in litigation. Should the SEC's authority be reduced in this space, what we're going to essentially have is a lot of status quo. Now, status quo could be a good or bad thing. In this case, if for those who believe in climate change, for example, it means continued exacerbation of shifts in weather and temperature patterns that are brought about by human activities. If we don't require these companies to disclose the climate risk associated therewith, then you're going to see a continuation of climate change without oversight or without steps to change. It means wealth concentration and a continued disparity in wealth distribution, because we're going to see a lot of directors or boards of directors not having to include the people who are may not be part of the, can I just say, white men, older white men? Can I just say that? Because what the Board Diversity Initiative is intended to do is to allow for these companies to speak. And when these companies speak and they say that we don't have, then allows for investors to decide where they want to put their money. What we've been seeing with the American public is that a lot of U.S. investors say, hey, look, I want to support, X, Y, and Z. All these companies, to a lot of investors, they all look about the same. So these investors say, well, I want to see a company with a woman on its board. That would make me more comfortable. I want to see a company that looks more like me. I want to see a company with an Asian American on its board. I want to see a company with an Indian American on the board, with an African American on its board. And when we don't allow for these companies to speak, then investors either going to have less insight into these companies that they invest in, or they're going to take their money elsewhere. What's interesting about all of this is that essentially that's already happening in the international space. For example, the European Union has this Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, which seeks much of the same information from European companies and also American companies who make, I think it's about over $150 million in those European countries. So if we don't require this rule in America, it may leave U.S. companies at a disadvantage, because on one hand, they'll be competing with these European companies, which will be already providing this information. And if investors want to invest in those companies because they see what they see, well, then that's great. And those kind of investors are going to take their money and go elsewhere. And the companies in America likely are going to follow suit, right? Then they're going to say, well, we're going to go ahead and disclose. But if you reduce the SEC's authority, then these companies are going to just disclose things almost, I don't want to say willy-nilly, but almost ad hoc, which creates disclosures which can't be comparable, which aren't reliable, and which aren't consistent. And some companies may say things which may not be, as accurate as you want it to be. So those who are against it in America, they're arguing that what's most important with American companies is the bottom line. I don't need to know that these companies are investing in social or equitable situations or issues. Some people say, I don't need to know that. All I need to know is that these companies are making as much money as possible. But unfortunately, that's not what the American public says. We have seen over and over data that says that this is a very important topic to U.S. investors. This has been an important topic to U.S. investors, especially in light of, for example, George Floyd back in 2020 at this point, especially in light of George Floyd. So we've seen a shift in America. We're seeing that shift, and it behooves our companies to follow suit. Those who oppose it disagree. And if I may, I'm not trying to get political whatsoever, but this just further pushes forth the point that Americans, if you're listening to this podcast, you need to vote. Not because you see it one way or another, but in order that your voice be heard. Because especially with the Securities Exchange Commission, a lot of what we do is based off what Congress decides, right? Congress acts, Congress passes statutes, and we pass the implementation regulations in accordance therewith. So when Congress says this, Y, or Z, because you elect the people to Congress, the president signs on to the bill that becomes a law. We've all seen that, I'm just a bill, that little cartoon way back in the day. And then what happens is then we decide or we implement the regulations. And if the mandate from Congress, if the mandate from the president is go left, we go left. If it's right, we go right. So it's important that whether or not you go left or right, that you vote so that your voice is heard.
Ken, this is so good. And you're taking like all the questions out of my mouth. I'm thinking of a question and you're answering it like before I can ask it. But one thing that you said that is so interesting is the bottom line comment, right? Like the argument for why these proposals make sense is that the Americans or institutional investors just care about the bottom line. And even if we accept that to be true, there is research that shows how equity and ethics and being, a good global citizen contributes to the bottom line, whether it's your ability to attract and retain the best talent, right? Because, people don't want to work for companies that they view as unethical. And when you have happy, productive colleagues, they inspire customer trust because they give a damn about what they're doing, right? And that brings about customer loyalty. And then you know what else? When you have a good workplace environment, you're less likely to get sued, which means you're not in the press for bad things. And investors don't want this, right? Investors want steady, reliable growth. So when you say that companies, people don't care about anything else and they just care about the bottom line, if you don't know that companies with a strong compliance culture and who are focused on these good citizenship activities actually outperform their peers, right? By almost every metric that matters, by almost 50%, right? You will be deceived into thinking that the bottom line isn't impacted by any of these things.
People need to know. That's not the messaging that's out there. So the people need to know. I think that's important.
Yeah.
Bianca, I'm ready to vote for you already.
I wish, I don't know. We'll see. Did we
We'll
just
down
get
that
an
next one.
endorsement for 2020
2020
right here on the podcast?
And occur to the capital.
As far as it all goes.
Yeah.
I know how I'm gonna vote for it too. We started getting ready.
Well, they started to tell us, right? But you talked about, for voters, right? Like, what do our voters need to know? What do the people who are starting to early vote, who are going to make their way out to the ballot box on November 5th, why should they care? And you can speak specifically about the proposals relevant to the Securities and Exchange Commission, but you are not monolithic, right? You have ideas and thoughts on things that are much broader, right? So feel free to interject those as well. But what do you think the voters need to care about when it comes to 2025?
I think that, and I talk to different friends who aren't lawyers in different spaces. And I think a lot of people get caught up when it comes to this election and voting and politics and government in general. And what they think is, oh, this doesn't affect me, right? They think that this is, some high level, this is, who cares who the president is? Who cares who the vice president is? Who cares who's in Congress? Long story short, a lot of people really, and the sad part is, and just a quick anecdote to that is that the sad part is a lot of people then don't even vote for local. A lot of people argue that it's only local government that matters, and then they don't go to the polls and they don't vote for local. They don't vote for state. They don't vote for a federal. I think it's so crucial that we're looking around and we talk, a little bit about transgender rights. We talk a little bit about LGBTQ rights. We talk a little bit about even African-American rights. We talk about the economy, not even on this, ephemeral, just what is the economy, but on your day-to-day, you go shopping and there's inflation, there's shrinkflation, there's so on and so forth. So many of these issues affect us on a day-to-day basis, and it begins at the top. Now, it doesn't end at the top, right? But I think it's important, if I can go back and put my SEC hat on, the president is the one who essentially at the SEC decides who the chair is. The chair of the SEC is the one who sets the agenda. When the agenda is set, that flows through to the entirety of the workforce, right? The SEC's mission is always going to be to protect investors, to maintain fair and orderly, efficient markets, and to facilitate capital formation. That's always going to be the case. But there's only so many hours in a day, only so many days in a month, only so many months in a year. So you have to prioritize. And when you choose who the president is, that chooses who the chair is, even though Ken's in his seat and tries to do everything he can to maintain the mission, and I will, and I do, at the end of the day, we still have these, we still have to follow suit with whatever is placed before us. We still have to follow the agenda of the chair. Now, this is only in the FCC space, which is very important because a lot of people talk about, oh, I don't have enough money. We talked earlier, we joke about how some people continue to want to vote for the current Republican candidate because when the current Republican candidate was president, the current Republican candidate gave out stimulus checks at a time when, hey, and apparently that's people's hearts, right? So that's great. Now imagine the stimulus check times 100. A lot of these decisions that these companies make are intended to build wealth for the company and their shareholders. Now, we hope that wealth in general is not a zero-sum game, but we know in large part it is. If some people have wealth, there's only a limited amount of wealth, whether on the planet Earth or whatever. There's some people who have wealth, and there are what we say forever, the haves and the have-not. This is even in the Bible, if you allow me to go ahead and put my little preaching hat on. It's even in the Bible.
Great.
The Bible talks about, right? The Bible talks about, and in fact, the Bible puts forth on those who have the responsibility to take care of those who have not. God never said that you won't have, you always have. It is to make sure that we share amongst each other, which you guys are doing, by the way, by sharing this information with your listeners. So that's, kudos to you. Shout out. But at the same time, yeah, so this is the requirement. So you were always going to have the haves and the have-nots. The issue is when you don't take an active part in your election, you cannot, and I'll say this, you cannot complain when you have not, because a lot of the people who are going to be, who are getting into office without your voice, then decides to only support those who voted for them or who voted for them or who supported them out loud. And if that's what happens, this is what continues the wealth disparity in America. What continues the wealth concentration, the inequality even socially in America. I don't have the statistics on this, but I do feel like there was a time when it felt like every single week we were turning on the news and we were seeing African Americans shot by police. I can go down the entire list of names. Obviously, Trayvon Martin started during the Obama administration, but that it felt like that there was this just ramping up during the following president's administration. And since 2020, 2021, obviously, we still have unfortunate incidences. However, it seems to be less, and I don't have the statistics on this. It's just, a personal anecdote. It seems to be less, and it seems that those who are in the wrong are being punished more. Or at least there isn't the message that there are good people on both sides. So these are, financially, I think is always going to be the most important thing that we need to address, because having allows you to do a whole lot more, just allows you to be a little bit more less anxious, allows you to just live a fuller life, which as Americans, we should have. The message continues that if you work 40 hours a week or 40 hours a week, you shouldn't have to, struggle to pay rent, to buy food, take yourself out every now and again, go on vacation in the richest country, not just in the world, the richest country that has ever existed. So I feel like this is part of the American system that a lot of Americans don't recognize, don't see, that there are a lot of these rules that affect you on a day-to-day basis. Even climate change. Right now, there's, we put the rule back, I believe, in March of this year, and it's getting a lot of pushback from certain special interests. But for those Americans who are really, worried about climate change, especially young Americans, now is the time for your voice to be heard.
With all of that good information, Ken, how do people figure out when and how to comment, right, during that notice and comment period? Where do they get that information from?
It's a great question. Great question. First place, sec.gov. We just had a jiggering, if you will, of our website. We are often and continuously trying to make it as user-friendly and accessible as possible, including our sister website, investor.org. If you are ever interested in investing, go to the investor.org, go to sec.gov, go to sec.gov. I believe it's investor.gov. Go to sec.gov, go to investor.gov. There's tons of information there, not only on just investing, teaching about compound interest, teaching about what types of, AI and how this new technology is affecting financial instruments and financial investing, but also just about what we do as the agency, what we do in terms of this process. We always put our rules out. We are a very, very transparent agency. Our entire thing is requiring transparency from these corporations and these companies. So you would imagine we are also transparent on our end. So there's a ton of information there.
You said one thing that should not be skirted. Well, you said a lot of things, but one thing that definitely shouldn't be skirted over is the local v federal voting, right? Like there was this wave at some point where there was this sort of idea, the federal government doesn't matter, just focus on voting locally. And we see now, right, if it wasn't clear before with the actions of the Supreme Court last term, you mentioned Loper Bright, obviously everyone knows about the impact on Roe v. Wade. We need to vote on both ends, right? Both ends. There's not one that's more important than the other. They are equally as important. It's a right, just like the voice that you mentioned we should use our power of our voice. We should use our power of our vote. Excellent. I love this. This was so good. I learned so much. Elise, you want to close us out?
Ken, just thank you so much for joining us and breaking down this part of Project 2025. I think the SEC is something that people hear about all the time. I think everybody is familiar with that acronym, but they probably don't even know what it stands for, much less what it does. So thank you so much for making it a little bit more clear to our listeners. And thank you with your point of how powerful everyone's voice is, educating those listeners so they can use that voice in their vote, as Bianca said. So thank you so much for joining us here on the 25th Hour podcast. And to our listeners, if you like what you heard today, please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.